I would say that sort of the old saying, make it easy to do business with you, is continues to be critically important because you can have a fantastic service. As a healthcare provider, you can do great work, but if it's difficult to get you integrated into other people's services, it can really impact negatively your ability to stay in business as an individual entrepreneur.
All right, welcome to the Medical Entrepreneur Podcast. Today we have a very special guest, a very smart man, Dejan Nenov. Welcome, Dejan. Thank you so much for coming on the Medical Entrepreneur.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm so excited to have you on because rarely do we get to talk to someone who is so intelligent, but also works with really the future of healthcare. Where everybody knows healthcare is, going digital. The government, of course, mandated people to get onto EMRs and these things. And so now, it's very rare to find, anyone practicing that doesn't have an EMR of some kind. And it seems like the world is getting more and more integrated. Are there any trends that you're seeing that would be wise for, someone who has their own medical practice to kind of be aware of?
Certainly, there is a trend of consolidation at the hospital system level of EMR systems. Everybody seems to be going to a system called Epic, which is dominant in the marketplace. At the same time, the cost and complexity of that system is probably a barrier for a small practice. And so the next layer down, you have these hundreds of small applications that are quite practice specific in many cases that are very useful for, a medical office. But they suffer from the fact that they typically are developed years ago, pre-cloud, new infrastructure world. And so now they struggle mostly in the need to integrate with many different other systems to make your practice run. A simple example is you need to integrate with a scheduling system that may be provided by a third party that's not necessarily inside your EMR. You may need to integrate with the companies providing revenue cycle management to help you actually get paid by insurance. You may need to integrate with a company that's offering you social media services to promote your practice, et cetera, et cetera. And all these things have usually a necessity to hook up somehow in some way in your EMR. And suddenly it becomes a significant cost and complexity that you have to deal with. And so the trend I am seeing is that there's a lot of legacy information systems infrastructure out there that, is really necessary to be upgraded. But at the same time, change is expensive and difficult. And so we have to work through this kind of evolution of digitalization, if you will.
Wow. And then for the listeners, could you maybe give a little bit about your background in your company?
Sure. So, we're an entrepreneurial podcast. So I've been doing what I call the Silicon Valley two-step with startups for the last 30 years or so. I'm an electrical engineer and computer science major that spent most of his time in software. I love it. It's exciting. It's something new every day. And I've dove deep into various verticals from cybersecurity to semiconductor design. And in the last 5 years or so, healthcare. I'm spending a lot of time around clinical workflows and laboratory testing systems, LIMS, and again, sort of new school workflows around medical testing. And I am also founder and investor in a medical diagnostic startup in the last 18 months or so. So I'm learning the hard way about all the regulatory and ethical and supply chain issues about bringing a diagnostics technology to market, as well as probably more than I ever wanted to know about clinical trials and writing protocols for them and recruiting sites and IRBs and all that interesting stuff.
Man, that's awesome. I think one of the things that we all see in healthcare is just everything's going digital. And like even we do have a lot of entrepreneurs that are, medicine based, I guess. And so we have physicians, nurse practitioners, RNs that are basically starting their own business and practice. And we've learned over time that, nowadays it used to be like, hey, you want to get an office near the hospital, you want to have a good sign, maybe put up some billboards, that kind of thing. And what we've seen now is that it's way more efficient to have everything digital. And so, you almost have to have a bigger digital footprint these days, and you even have a physical,
I would say that sort of the old saying, make it easy to do business with you, continues to be critically important. As a healthcare provider, you can do great work, but if it's difficult to get you integrated into other people's services, it can really impact negatively your ability to stay in business as an individual entrepreneur. The company and a system that I'm involved in called One Health, we took an approach there saying that anybody who wants to join a platform as a service provider, as a partner, and a phlebotomist to an elderly person at their home can immediately take advantage of your service and build you into their workflow for caring for the patient. If you're maybe a genetic counselor, same thing. You come onto a platform, you say, I provide this type of service in this area, and immediately become integrated and available. So I'm sure, of course, there's other platforms and ways to accomplish that, but I think conceptually that's very important, which is how easy is it able to do business with by other partners and to sort of integrate yourself into, because, unlike the guy that comes to fix my refrigerator when it breaks, healthcare is a little bit, it has more than one party involved in any one healthcare or sort of engagement or workflow.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I remember there was a guy, this was a long time ago, like when the first iPhone came out, and there was actually a medical doctor, and I think he was in Brooklyn or New York, one of the two. And he was like the first doctor to have an iPhone. And what he basically did is he just started to take people for cash, and they would only text him. And this was before a lot of the HIPAA stuff came out, that's like not cool to do that. But basically he was essentially a doctor via text, and there was like a new thing at the time because iPhones were just rolling out. And he ended up actually leaving his insurance-based practice and just going full-time cash, because he made himself easy, like you said, to do business with, because now people just text. They didn't have to call, get an appointment, come in, and so I think that's a very wise statement. And we see this, over and over in the practice of medicine. And nowadays, if most doctors don't have good reviews online, if they don't have, a website that's easy to read, if they don't have a way that people can reach out within a few seconds, like a chat widget or something, those customers are going to go somewhere else,
I mean, in all honesty, the hospital systems are starting to do a better job in offering telemedicine. The last time I caught the flu, which was 4 weeks ago, very unfortunate because I thought I was vaccinated for everything under the sun, but I still got a very bad flu, and I was able to, be seen virtually by a nurse practitioner within an hour of me signing up. It's fantastic because, otherwise having to go sit in a waiting room or schedule a meeting for tomorrow, a consultation for tomorrow, it's not nearly as, not only convenient, but it's better care for me because, I get my medicine in a few hours and I just psychologically feel better because I was seen.
Yeah.
So for sure, yeah, it's, technology has the potential to greatly improve healthcare if we can solve the challenges around it.
For sure. One of the things I was going to mention is that your company, is it Panaton?
Panaton Software, yep.
So one of the things that I found, like I remember when I first had my own lab, so I had a big practice with a lab that we had, a CLIA certified lab, the whole thing. And I remember exactly kind of as you mentioned before we started the podcast, was just like we had to hire a consultant, and I think it was like $20,000 just to send the data from the lab like to our EMR. And just as a doctor, I remember this is like a huge investment just to deal with computer stuff. And I kept thinking like, man, this is crazy, but because it was, I own the practice, like I had to get this done. What would you say to someone who is, is it like, maybe they're a medical entrepreneur, like they're not an expert at IT, they don't know all the stuff. What could they expect? And like, should they reach out to you if they need to do stuff like that? Like maybe you can give us a little bit of tips.
Certainly, our company does a lot of work in integrating this kind of systems, and there's a whole bunch of colleagues out there that are excellent. My first advice is don't take the first quote. Spend a few days getting a second opinion of cost and time. I've seen time and time again, I spend a lot of time around labs. There's probably 150 LIMS systems, lab information management systems out there. Some of them very robust, but almost all of them were built in the days before sort of the modern cloud world. So they're intended to be installed in the lab and operate in the lab. And now suddenly people want an ordering a way to order from the lab through a web page. They want the lab to be able to send reference tests to another lab. They want to integrate with this hospital system so that they can take tests from them or another hospital system over here. Now, suddenly, the LIMS provider, mostly because of lack of resources and somewhat older technology, would charge $25,000, $30,000 and take 3 months to do one integration between 2 points, for work that another company could do for $2,000 to $5,000 in 2 weeks. And so there's this great discrepancy between a sort of what we generally consider today's expectation in terms of time and cost versus what legacy providers can do. It's not necessarily that they're overcharging. It's just really because there's fewer people that can do the work, and there's a lot of work to be done. And so, my first advice is anything information systems related for medical practice, do your homework, shop. Don't take the first quote because you can literally save non-trivial amounts of time, most importantly, but also money in building out infrastructure or doing some custom integration things.
And you had also mentioned before that, in a case where someone maybe needs to set up what's called an API or application programming interface.
APIs?
This is quite common for doctors to run into this. They have an EMR, their lab system's totally different. Maybe they're even working with a third-party lab. Is that something you'd mentioned before that there's been a lot of cost savings in that? In the past, people will quote, 20, 30K for these kind of connections.
Sure.
How does someone maybe save money on that?
Bring in an independent party with experience that can call out things that don't make sense, right? So, in our medical world, if you find a service provider that has experience with the HO7 and FHIR APIs, and then Epic is quite dominant, and then on the lab side with a few LIMS that are out there, they have this experience moving information between healthcare providers. We are able to then give you an idea of what an efficient way of doing things would be. Often the challenge is that you have to get cooperation from the IT department of the other parties. So, the hospital IT department, like everybody else, is overworked. So trying to get them to pay attention, to integrate with you, is sometimes takes 4 times as long as actually doing the work. Getting a vendor of a legacy system to say yes to you to build an API sometimes is challenging because they may feel like they're threatened by new technology kind of stepping into their patch. But ultimately, you as the manager, owner of the practice, have the ultimate say, because you can always say, I want it done this way, help me. And how can we do this faster, which always means less expensive.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the things that you said before is that many times, like if someone were to work with you, for example, that same cost that might be like 20K might all go down to like 2K. Is that your estimate or just ballpark?
We do have a program in place that says one point-to-point connection between 2 healthcare information systems of one type of data. Let's say a lab wanting to send a result into a patient chart encounter, which is known as observation in HO7 world. We will do that for you for 2K in 2 weeks, provided that both parties are willing to play.
Yes. That's huge. I mean, I wish I had known you back then because I spent like, I think 20K on just the connections so you can see my lab data, But,
Adam, this is basic economics, right? A software firm for hire, it's a time and materials business, right? So an outsourced software engineer costs you between $8,000 and $10,000 a year. If they have the experience for them to, you need one engineer to do an implementation like this. Worst case takes them a week, 40 days to build, test, deploy, 40 hours. 40 hours at $50 an hour is 2K.
Yeah.
It's very basic math that everybody can understand. So when somebody comes in and says, it's going to cost $25,000 to do this integration, take me 3 months. I'm like,
why?
Okay, but, we are, reinventing warm water here, right? Versus, showering every day.
Man, that's so true. I'm just like, I think there'll be a lot of people that probably reach out to you just because of that, because it's always an area that I've found a sticking point over and over with healthcare companies that I've built.
I'm a little bit of a contrarian very often. So I want to actually give you another case study, which may be interesting. We tend to run into writing software to integrate, where very often it's much cost effective to do things manually. I'll give you an example. You have a clinical trial, you need to enter 1,000 patient records into a system anonymously, maybe 20, 30 data fields, right? If you try to do that integration to an MR system, a month to do it, like 2 to 4 weeks to do it, $10,000-$20,000, and you have to get all these parties to collaborate. But if you could hire a remote data entry person that costs you $10, $12 an hour, that can do 10 records an hour even, if you do the math, it will get done in 10 days for a fraction of the cost without the complexity to maintain. So, cutting my own throat here as I'm in the software integration business, right? But the reality is, as a business owner, when I have to accomplish some information processing task, I've kind of learned the hard way to first ask, can this be done manually? Can this be done in an Excel spreadsheet? Can this be done by an expert better than passing it on to, some software person like me that has general understanding of programming, but does not have the domain knowledge. And so start there before you go and spend, a ton of money on writing custom software, maybe a one-off.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think also you make a really good point, but I think, would you not say that with software, because one of the things I see with laboratory is that, yes, you could totally have a human do it, and even for a fraction of the cost, much faster, but then it becomes like, hey, this is happening every day for, 300 lab tests.
Well, certainly, again, if things are one-off, you may consider doing it manually. The moment you have volume, the moment you're past 10, 20 tests a day, you need automation. Mostly because you're now in a space where human error is much more likely, and human error is very, very problematic, obviously, in healthcare. Yeah. And so that's where automation is good, because you have more control and repeatability, right? Once your medical director has signed off on the test requisition taking and accessioning and providing results and checking results and all the clear lab instrument calibration and all the jazz.
checks.
Once that is in, because it's automatic, it's now repeatable. You don't have to worry about me mistyping a 6 for a 7, which can, in a test result can be quite horrible. So then it makes sense, and then the cost is justified.
Makes sense. What do you see kind of, you have this kind of two worlds where you kind of work a little bit in healthcare, but also in computers in Silicon Valley. What do you see coming forward? We have things that we've never run into before in medicine, where we now have, Amazon Prime that's offering, $6 a month healthcare. You got the model of medicine is rapidly changing and evolving. Is there any trends that you see or things that medical entrepreneurs could take advantage of?
Healthcare is a very complex world, especially in North America, especially in the United States, right? I believe that ultimately an individual is responsible for taking care of themselves, in the sense that I want to be involved in the care that I'm given. I want to understand what's happening and to make choices. So if you ask me, would you want to buy an at-home test to get screened for diseases? I would say absolutely. So, granted, they're expensive and not very accessible, but there's Grail out there that will screen you for 50 cancers. There's Cologuard that you can take in essentially a replacement with better accuracy than a colonoscopy, if you read the clinical trial materials, right? So I'm one of the people that would take advantage of those things. However, the medical professional, on the other hand, with a very valid reason, will tell you, you cannot rely on medical tests to get diagnosed. You need to see a physician that will take the big picture of your case, understand comorbidities, other diseases that you may have, lifestyle, genetics, take everything into account so that you then get the proper treatment plan. You cannot argue with that either. The problem is, today, when you go see somebody, they're on the clock, they can give you 15 minutes of their time. So the case being made for the general practitioner or even the specialist giving you the kind of care that they aspire to certainly becomes less of a valid argument versus, hey, can I get a at-home screening test if we can do this at a cost which makes sense for population level health, than to not to do that. And these issues are complex. They're not, I must admit that I'm torn off from, especially when we step into sort of the realm of sort of ethics and really caring for people properly, that things are not quite black and white.
It's very true. I do think that it doesn't really matter. Like, what I see over and over is that there is a big push by the people that are paying for health insurance to essentially say, hey, look, we need to get the cost down. We need to make this more available. And, a lot of times we see that just like you were describing, the quality of healthcare has gone down significantly since the insurers have really got involved. As big insurance got more involved, we see, just the reason why a doctor only has 15 minutes or like a dermatologist has 5 minutes between visits is because the reimbursements are incredibly low and they haven't been raised in probably 20 years, despite all the inflation that's happened. And so you got people that are saying, like, I got to see 50 patients a day. And like, you're exactly right. The healthcare suffers because of that. But some of that is the economics of the system as well.
Certainly. And I'm not an MD, and you know better than me what it takes to become a board certified physician. This is a incredible investment in effort, financial, time. You're basically dedicating your life to becoming a doctor. I think in modern society, that kind of dedication, new people coming into the pipeline is harder and harder to come by. So I think there's this, kind of a systemic issue also in producing healthcare professionals who are authorized to see patients and prescribe. And there may need to be a rethink of the system of where there's really the MD and then kind of the nurse practitioner, and there's not much else in there in between. And so maybe technology can be applied to address some of these efficiencies, but I think we're still, both in terms of regulatory and technology maturity, but also in kind of thinking through the ethical issues, kind of at least a decade away from that.
Absolutely. I would just be curious if I could get your opinion also. Like, we've now seen because of technology, we now have the ability to solve problems on a greater scale. One example is the American Arthritis Foundation has a knee quiz that basically I helped them develop. And all it is that it's the same algorithm I would use if someone came into the ER and it had knee pain. Like, how would I diagnose them? We basically put it into an online quiz. People can take it online. And then at the end, they're told, like, hey, this isn't medical advice. This is not a physician-patient relationship. But based on your responses, these are like the 3 or 4 things that are the most likely. Here's what we're going to email you, and take this now to your doctor, your nurse practitioner, or wherever you go. Cause that way, at least it starts them on the right path, When you see things like this, do you see kind of a world where essentially you could have somewhat of like a medical doctor using technology to extend the ability for them to treat more patients through automations and AI?
Absolutely. The challenge there is threading the needle, so to speak, in terms of what would be considered ethical, not ethical, FDA approved, not FDA approved, and really what is meaningful to a patient. So I'm currently struggling with similar issues, and again, this medical startup that I'm involved in, which, ultimately our vision is to be able to give you a panel test from a urine sample that will give you the probability of, let's say, more 50 that you may have one of 50 diseases, and basically say, hey, based on the results of our test, you fall into a group. 98% of people with your metabolic profile do not have this disease. But on this one, you fall into the group, 73% of the people with the same metabolic profile do have this disease, right? And there's a lot of pushback of providing that kind of information direct to the patient without involvement of a physician. So what a lot of our advisors are saying, there's actually even better and simpler value that will not get you into trouble with the FDA because your software is not performing diagnostics. We won't be performing diagnostics without 510K pre-approval, pre-market approval. But if you can just tell me this person has an oncological versus inflammatory versus autoimmune versus virus condition, even if you can give me just that triage, so I can focus on in the area where I need to spend, invest time and effort to do a proper differential diagnosis, that's good enough.
Yeah, that would be
and
huge.
So the answer, the answer to your question, the original question is yes, the technology is there. Yes, we can, add value, but the devil is in the detail. And again, I think with the maturing of technology as well as the regulatory environment around the technology, these things will become more clear, which will empower more entrepreneurs to actually bring products to market without kind of doing 2 step forward, 1 step back, and finding their way through the maze.
Absolutely. What about, just out of curiosity, where other areas in medicine do you see AI or building computer learning systems would kind of change either the practice of healthcare or how it's delivered?
I mean, certainly in the areas of imaging analysis, imaging labs, there are today extremely mature machine learning trained systems that do, to my knowledge, as good or better job than a human looking at slides and X-rays and MRIs. So in the imaging side, I think technology is super mature. As a clinical decision support system where we can feed the latest and greatest research into a system and have it pop up information to a physician as they're taking their notes for a patient visit or encounter and say, oh, by the way, here's this articles on this symptoms and that you may or may not be aware of. And, how many humans can actually stay current on all the new developments every day that happen. So that's very much viable. Basically taking free text of notes and then using the ChatGPT and Bard-like systems that are essentially better search today to provide us references to the latest and greatest information and research that we should but may not be aware of. I think that's very viable. With the one caveat, the technology right now is untrustworthy. It hallucinates. It invents things. We'll fix that. I guarantee it. It will get fixed pretty quickly. Right now, I would not touch, a large language model, generative model to rely on without checking absolutely every factual statement it makes, because they tend to invent things that don't exist. That will get fixed. But the fact that you can have 100 million pages of PubMed and Elsevier documentation processed by an AI system and make it immediately relevant to a patient that you're seeing right now, I think that's extremely valuable. As long as it's couched again as a decision support system and not as a diagnostic system. And there's many use cases. There's many use cases in monitoring patients when they're under care for all the vital signs and finding patterns where you have to worry about cardiac issues or other issues by just monitoring the data that comes out of the usual systems that you're hooked into when laying in the hospital. Those are pretty obvious cases. But so, great opportunities. I think the more interesting opportunities are in drug discovery, as well as obviously diagnostics, which I'm involved in. But even on the clinical care side, again, the technology is marching along.
Wow. That's pretty amazing, because you're exactly right. That would change everything, having the ability to have connection to all the latest research immediately, at your fingertips, knowing everything's up to date, not dependent on, the 1 or 2 times a year you do continuing education credits or whatever.
And these are practical. So again, you can go to a conference, you're going to see some very impressive demos and things. And then you go home and say, okay, but how do I actually use this every day? And it's not clear. But there are solutions that are clear today. I can give you dozens of examples. the one that I really like is, as a doctor is ordering a medical test, again, because I'm in the medical testing space, we have the ability to pop up a decision support window and say, hey, that ICD-10 code you're assigning is wrong. Or maybe you should consider this other test to order because they're more appropriate for the condition that you're trying to diagnose, to verify the diagnosis. Because if you're using this one, only 20% of the time it's useful. And by the way, insurance won't pay for it. But if you use these top 3, which are most useful for this condition, that not only you're going to get better result, but you're more likely to get reimbursed.
Yeah.
And that is available today. It is very simple. It's not even that. I mean, it's kind of borderline AI and ML, but it is just information matching, if you would. So those kind of things, which are small things, but make a huge difference, are readily available.
Wow. And it does seem like one thing I've noticed is that, before I kind of went to transition to everything to all cash, was back when I was dealing with the insurance companies, it did seem to me like the insurance companies were accelerating on their ability to deny claims, to mess around with you, to request extra documentation. And I swear, as soon as AI started to kind of gain traction, that's when it seemed like they just started getting really aggressive with these kind of things.
That is true, but it's a double-edged sword, right? Because I can tell you what the documentation needs to be to increase your probability of getting paid by the insurance, by the claim being approved, by, again, looking retrospectively at what was approved and what was not approved, and inferring the medical necessity, sign-off, the ICD-10 codes and CPT codes that are likely to get approved before you actually perform the procedure or order the test. So just like the insurance company can apply technology and artificial intelligence even to process unstructured documents and say, we're denying because you ordered these things which are unnecessary and don't have good clinical results in your value-based care, which is valid. At the same time, I can say, no, I chose these procedures, I chose these tests. I can demonstrate conclusively that, that they're necessary because the patient exhibiting the symptoms have this medical history, as well as they're the recommended procedure by my, board. And so again, we have the technology to sort of match the technology, if you will.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see that a little bit because I have seen people use Bard and ChatGPT to write letters of medical necessity, which has always been a huge pain because typically the insurances, what I've seen in just most modern, called mainstream medicine practices where they're actually taking insurance like Medicare, Blue Cross Blue Shield, these kind of guys like United, those companies, I believe, are using machine learning on their end to figure out how the best way to deny claims are. In the past, they just literally used to have things where it was very common knowledge that if you sent 100 claims into, let's give you an example, like United Healthcare, 10% of those claims would just be thrown out and then they would process the other 90 and it'd be up to you to recognize those 10 that never made it and then rebill them. They knew that, hey, some percentage of people wouldn't do that in a timely manner and they wouldn't have to pay those. And so I kind of started seeing some of those coming down, and it's good to see some things coming back up to help us fight against those things. And do you see a day where, at some point, as a physician, is it possible that we could actually use the technology to say, hey, I want to train an AI model with everything I've learned and then deploy that model to do work?
If all parties in the system make it a priority to provide better care, we have solutions to offer. We rail against the insurance company, but they will tell you that there's an incredible amount of fraud. Health system and healthcare providers, they're stuffing unnecessary procedures and overcharging, and which the data shows as well. Even if you just use the Medicare, Medicaid data, which is publicly accessible. So they have some valid concerns. At the same time, they're in the business of denying claims because that's how they make money. So there's this dichotomy of providing a public service, but also providing value for your owners and investors, right? On the hospital side is the same thing. If we use technology to optimize the delivery of care, which is the most cost-effective and applicable to the need of the patient, we all win. Everybody gets paid. It's lower cost. Most people get seen. We detect disease earlier, we treat it better outcomes, so, et cetera, et cetera. But, if we approach the system with use technology to better serve the patient, both in terms of delivery of service, but also cost, we all win. If we focus on optimizing just the needs of the insurance company, or just the needs of the hospital, or just the need of the anesthesiologist, or just the need of the lab, outside of the bigger context, invariably you're going to get pushback and tilting the system in the direction which at least some will perceive as inappropriate.
Absolutely. Do you feel that there's like now with the way technology is, like, with ChatGPT now, you can basically build your own, GPT, you can load it up with, I think it's like 10 books or something like this. Like,
no, you cannot. You cannot build your own GPT. You can get a language model, which is a small one that is medically trained. I believe there's one from Meta, which is you can run on your own server in the cloud. But it's the difference between building, a Go kart and an F1 car. So anybody who tells you can build your own GPT doesn't know what they're talking about. You can use technology to tune the GPT that OpenAI or Microsoft, or Google's Bard will provide to you, to take into account a body of knowledge which is specific to your needs. But even that is a very costly process and requires serious expertise. Don't give it to your cousin's high school son to do, or daughter, because they will follow a YouTube video and that is not going to end up well. So careful with the AI stuff. The good, there's no free cheese. The good stuff costs a lot, and you actually require expertise to do it.
Oh, I think what I was referring to is that on ChatGPT now, you can actually make your own, I guess, model. They call it your own GPT, where you can label it. And it is exactly like you said, it is ChatGPT, but then you're allowed to give it parameters and load it with some pre-existing information. And I think the limit is like, you can load it with 10 PDFs of 100 megs each. And so you could basically give it like 10 decent books, I guess, or if you will. And like, it would load that information, then it would process that. And then it would, obviously the ChatGPT model underneath, but now it has specialized information, and then you can give it a name.
Sure.
Do you feel like there's any, is there any practical way that maybe, a medical professional could use AI to actually basically extend their reach? Like, would there ever be a case for using something like that to like help patients? Or where do you see a way that people can today essentially use that technology to expand?
So, this is a use case that we spend a lot of time looking at. And in the perfect world, we would have full medical records for a patient from birth until today. And it is that body of medical records that we would build a tuned model for, so that the generic knowledge of medical knowledge that a ChatGPT technology-powered system focused on medicine can bring can take into account all the medical records, genetics, medical history, phenotype, et cetera, at the current moment in time state of the patient's health, and use the combination of the two to give you information about risk, treatment, possible treatment if they're symptomatic for something or all that. The problem with that is that you have to build that tuned model for each individual patient. Right now, that's cost prohibitive. Also, there's actually a bigger problem, which is easier to solve, but actually more difficult to solve, which is we have no way of actually getting the complete medical records for a patient. Historic. That is impossible. Yes, we have the legislation that created the healthcare exchanges, and we're supposed to be able to pull medical records if you have an NPI number in your medical professional. But the reality is, the medical records for the surgery that I had 22 years ago, I can never find.
Yeah,
they're not going to be around. And so there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem.
For sure. Do you see any way that people, like, are there any technologies you know of offhand that a medical entrepreneur could use today to like increase their impact or anything like that?
Um, I mean, it's a case by case thing. When medical entrepreneur is such a broad thing. But absolutely, I think the audience that you reach out to most of all are people who are kind of stepping away from the payer model and into direct patient services. So a lot of that, I think, it requires education of the market and promotion of the service, which takes you into a more kind of a social media and awareness world. At the same time, you need a set of tools, of technologies to run your business and operate it. You still need to be HIPAA compliant. You still have to worry about privacy. You still need to keep your medical records. You still need to order labs. You still have to create treatment plans. You still have to schedule your visits and all of those things. And so there is where, you can now find really good technology fairly inexpensively that can match or do better than incumbent systems that hospitals use.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it's definitely a good time for most people to use technology, because one way is that, one thing we see is we have a software called Click Practice. It just allows basically a physician to get a website with a chat widget, with text messaging built in, with email marketing built in, like all that stuff put together. Just because nowadays, just to get the basics up, it is now way more complex than it was, 10 years ago or 20 years ago,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, interface to your accounting system for yourself and for your tax accountant and for your payroll. I mean, there's basic things that, we take for granted, but actually take time.
Man, that is that is so true. And it's like, nowadays, everything, you want everything connected as much as possible. But I think you made a good point that sometimes just doing things kind of just, even if it's just for a short period of time manually, might just be the best solution.
For sure. Yeah. We always say, don't try to boil the ocean, to eat the elephant one bite at a time.
And then I wanted to ask a question. We have a lot of people that listen that are physician and nurse practitioners that are investors, and they kind of see what the area you're working in. They see a future of healthcare where everything is digital, is driven digitally, that kind of thing. As an investor, do you see any areas that, you should focus on in terms of areas that you think are areas that are primed for growth within healthcare and technology?
This is a longer conversation. And, first of all, I'm not qualified to give investment advice to anyone. So anything I say, obviously, should be considered inaccurate, and don't spend money on things based on the statements. I'm an investor in a medical diagnostics company. I believe that medical diagnostics, which take advantage of the modern machine learning, notice I say machine learning first before artificial intelligence, tools are viable. Platforms, what we call cloud-based multi-tenanted platforms that enable healthcare services to be delivered to consumers, are viable. I think some mobile applications would do health monitoring and wellness holistically rather than only one thing at a time are viable. And someday there will be a company that will rebuild an EMR system from the ground up, good enough to serve hospital systems with a modern, non-obsolete technology set. And I will invest in that company.
Wow. Yeah, I think I could totally see that, because even as somebody who's used Epic, you mentioned before, man, they leaves a lot to be desired. So
again, there's gray areas. Epic is a fantastic system that is very mature, and it understands really well all the clinical use cases. Having said that, it would be nice if there were a way for Epic to empower entrepreneurs to take advantage of the ecosystem. And, the fact that, again, all that learning was over, 40 years of experience with hospitals, but when you're based on 40-year-old technology, fundamentally, you need to retool. And that's a process.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly like, you have apps on your phone that are many times so much easier to interpret data from than trying to scroll through a virtual machine through another window and, pressing, left and right, in order to see the, I can tell you many stories about using those legacy systems and, how crazy they are. And many times you spend more time working on the technology than you actually seeing the patient. And then it's like, well, what's the purpose here? Thank you so much. And thank you for joining the Medical Entrepreneur Podcast. Really appreciate it. It was a great conversation, Dejan.
Pleasure.
And thank you again for your time.